The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nova's presentation of Secure 2.0 Long-Term Part-Time with Steve Best and Craig Hoffman. Before we get started, I would like to point out the panel on the top right-hand corner of your screen. You're going to see a drop-down for chat, and this is where you will enter any questions that you may have for Steve and Craig. Please keep in mind that the Q&A portion of this webinar will be held at the end, and they will answer as many questions as time permits. If time runs out and you still have questions, please send them to our email address, webinars@nova401k.com. Right below chat, you will see the handouts dropdown. Here you will be able to download today's material. Today's session qualifies for ASPA and IRPA credit. If you are with us today to earn continued education credits, please be sure to stay until the end to fill out our pop-up survey. This is going to allow us to track your time and participation. Certificates will be sent out within a week for those who have met the time requirements. To view any webinars you may have missed and the recording of this session, you can follow us on our YouTube channel, which is Nova 401k Associates, or visit our website, which is www.nova401k.com/webinars. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would now like to introduce Nova's attorney and senior consultant, Craig Hoffman, and Nova's VP and shareholder, Steve Best.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Again, our presentation here is on LTPT employers, really for LTPT employees, what employers need to know, and it's specifically geared towards employers. So this session, just to go through the normal disclaimer, is not intended for to substitute for legal tax advice, and you should consult a qualified professional for that. And it also qualifies for ASPA and IRPA credit. Again, this entire presentation is geared specifically for plan sponsors, so keep that in mind for anybody else that's on here that is not one of those individuals. Quick agenda, we'll go over some big picture items, a few of the basics, go through some of the rules involving employer contributions, vesting, counting how you count service to determine your long-term part-time employees, a quick recap, and then if we can get to them, some frequently asked questions. So big picture, I always like to start with this slide because you know, the model that we use here at Nova is what we call an unbundled model. So in any 401k arrangement, there are typically 4 distinct roles that have to be played, and normally they're played by different individuals, right? So right now we have the plan sponsor. You guys determine that you want to have a plan. Your primary responsibility, the reason I'm showing this here is one of the primary responsibilities of the plan sponsor is to enroll your participants on time in terms of who becomes eligible and when. You can get help from some of your providers sometimes, but typically this is one of the primary roles that you have to deal with. And so none of the other providers generally are actively enrolling people unless you've got some special 360 connections and so forth, which I can go over a little later. But we here at Nova are the TPA, so we maintain your plan document, handle all of your testing, and all of the IRS compliance that goes along with 401k plans. And then you'll also have an investment advisor and whatever investment provider that you're using. That could be John Hancock, Principal. We deal with quite a few, Empower. So each of your companies could be with a different company that provides different services and levels of service. So under the current law, plans could be drafted to exclude part-time employees who never work 1,000 hours in any 12-month eligibility computation period. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. Now, under Secure 1.0 and 2.0, this has been changed so that certain part-time employees have to be allowed to at least contribute from their paychecks into a 401k plan, and this becomes effective for entry dates beginning in January 1st, 2024. All right, now what is I know this is, information is coming to you a little late in the year, and what's the big rush now? Well, Secure 2.0 was passed last December, and we have been asking for guidance from the IRS for quite some time now, and of course, they They released proposed regulations November 24th on Black Friday. So there's no transitional relief at the moment, and everybody's scrambling to determine how we can help you best understand these rules and then how to enroll any long-term part-time employees you may have. So under this law, you're generally not required to provide any employer contributions to this group of people. There are going to be some accelerated vesting requirements that we'll go into here shortly. And generally, including these individuals or having to include these individuals in your plan will not negatively affect your annual non-discrimination testing that, again, NOVA provides and computes for you, or any of, again, you don't have to give them the employer contribution. So they're disregarded from any aspects of the plan. The most immediate decisions that you need to make really are, does my plan already comply with the, based on my existing design and entry dates and eligibility waiting period, do I already comply with these rules and not have to worry about them, right? Or do I really have these individuals in my plan and now I have to worry about complying with the rules? So your choices are going to be, do I really want to deal with all these rules? And we'll see how complex and complicated they become if you have individuals that have to come into your plan. Or do I want to simply change my plan design and amend it to some eligibility requirement that excludes me from having to deal with these rules? So the mandate, now what is or who is an LTPT, a long-term part-time employee? So as of January 1st, 2024, employees who work between 500 hours and 999 hours in 3 consecutive years or eligibility computation periods are going to need to be offered the plan. They can no longer be excluded. This applies primarily to 401k plans. You can exclude the service period that you're going to look at prior to January 1st, 2021. And also, to make things even more complicated, Secure 2.0 changed the rule to 2 consecutive computation periods instead of 3, beginning in January 1st of 2025. One other side note is that currently the ERISA 403B plans are excluded from these LTPT rules, but only until January 1st of 2025. So just a very simplistic, we have more complicated examples, but just a very simplistic example here of what we're looking at. Again, you can exclude hours prior to 2021, and you need to be looking at people that are in this hours range, right? 500 hours to 999 hours. And if they meet those rules, and I would just say, for now, look at it on a calendar year basis, right? If they work those number of hours, then they're an LTP employee, just like the first row here. On the second row, right, work 400 hours in one of the years, same with the third row, so they don't qualify. All right, so this is what we're looking at a very basic level. So what plans are exempt? Defined benefit plans, cash balance plans, which are DB plans as well. The 457s, 403Bs until 2025. And if you don't even have employee elections possible in your plan for profit sharing only, they don't apply to those either. So you can still have an age requirement in your plan. So even if I have an employee who qualifies under the hours range requirement, right? And they're not, let's say 21, if that was a requirement in your plan, you can still apply that requirement. They don't enter your plan as LTP employees, LTPT employees. The eligibility, we'll talk more about this, but the computation periods that we're talking about for initial eligibility are typically computed on an anniversary year basis for the first year, and then may switch to the calendar year in future years, just based on what your document says, right? Now, most of NOVA's documents do switch to the calendar year after, or the plan year, I should say. Most plans are calendar years, so, but it is the plan year. we do use the switching technique in our documents. All right, and again, service prior to 2021 is not counted for either determining who the LTPT employees are or for any vesting that has to be applied to them. I want to go over some service counting methodologies here as well, because this will come into play in describing how you can avoid these rules. But there are generally two ways to count service. There's an hours method, right? So that requires a certain number of hours have to be worked during a computation period to get credit for, let's say, a year of service, for example. Elapsed time method is a crediting method that looks at periods of time but doesn't require any specific hours to be required within that period. So, most initial waiting periods shorter than 1 year, for example, are generally computed on an elapsed time basis, and you don't look at hours, how many hours are worked in the initial eligibility period for periods that are shorter than a year. All right. Also, elapsed time methods, whether you have a 1 year wait on elapsed time method or a 3-month wait, they don't exclude part-timers, generally speaking, right? Because you're not looking at how many hours they work, all right? Just by the computation method alone. So looking at it visually, and this is an example of currently, if you have a 1 year of service wait in your plan with 1,000 hours required, which is very typical, this is how it works. So the initial computation period, so let's say we have somebody that hires 6/1 of 2022. You have to go to the 12-month anniversary date, 6/1/2023, and ask the question, did they work 1,000 hours in that period? And as you can see, it crosses calendar years, right? To make it easier in future periods to figure out who's eligible under the 1 year wait, our plan documents switch to the plan year, which in this case is a calendar year. So for if you have somebody that did not work 1,000 hours in the first period, you then look to see, did they work 1,000 hours in the second period, which is the 2023 calendar year. And there's an overlap in the hours, right? But if you think about it, if you didn't do it this way, you literally, every single hire that you make in your company throughout the year, you'd have a different computation period. If you never switched, you'd have an endless number of computation periods for each of your, you could have as many as 365 or more. So it is easier to switch the computation period, and this is how the 1 year wait works. So what plan designs don't have to worry about these new rules? All right, so if you're in a elapsed time plan with no service-based exclusion, meaning I have no part-time exclusion in my plan document, or temporary or seasonal, all right, then you don't have to worry about these rules, because your plan does not exclude long-term part-time employees based on its design. A 3-month wait does not exclude part-timers. 6 months, 9 months, right? It doesn't exclude them. So I don't have to worry about the rules. Another one is if you had a service waiting period that requires hours of 500 or less, right? That requires somebody to work 500 hours, right? Again, you're not, based on that initial eligibility waiting requirement, the minute somebody works 500 hours, they're going to come in, right? So again, it's not excluding these types of individuals. So this type of plan design is extremely rare. So primarily you're going to see 1 year of service waits with 1,000 hours, or some sort of shorter waiting period that's done on a elapsed time basis. That's 99% of our plans. Also, if you don't actually employ, if you have no individuals or employees that qualify under these hours rules, right? You've got this hours range in 3 consecutive years, starting in 2021, then I don't have to worry about these rules, right? If these are consistently long-term part-time employees working these numbers of hours. If you don't have them, you don't have to worry about them. Excluded classes, right? You can still, the plan documents can have non-service-based exclusions. Let's say I'm excluding field workers or hourly employees. Can I still do that? Yes, I can, so long as it's not some sort of disguised service-based exclusion. Like I can't say my exclusion is field workers and 95% of the people in that category are part-time. I've got a problem there, right? So I can't do that. Part-time, seasonal, temporary are service-based exclusions, and generally they're still going to be permitted, but it would complicate your plan design to leave those in so much that we would not recommend that you keep those in your plan any longer. Okay, I'm not switching here. Okay. Employer contributions. So if you've determined that you actually employ long-term part-time employees, then you're going to have to comply either by plan design and eliminating having to worry about the rules, or you're going to have to comply and decide whether to include them in your employer contributions. You can exclude them from all forms of employer contributions, the match, safe harbor, your top-heavy minimums, if you've got a top-heavy plan, profit sharing, basically all employer contributions. The legal documents will have to be amended to reflect what you're doing. Our defaults for NOVA are going to be that the LTPT employees are excluded from employer contributions. And why? I mean, we really don't want to be spending your money without your permission, essentially, right? We can't write a default amendment that would include them and then cost you a lot more money potentially, right? So if you want to do something different, we're going to need to know about it so we can design a more custom amendment for your plan, right? Now, why would I want to include LTPT individuals for my employer contributions? Well, again, it's a lot of hassle to exclude them, especially if you're a payroll by payroll type of matching plan, right? Because in your payroll system, I'm sure that when somebody starts their deferrals, a lot of those systems are automatically going to compute the match so that it can be funded. Now you're going to have an indicator in there of some kind that this person's an LTPT employee and I don't want to give them the match or don't compute the match. So there's a payroll as well as a record keeper update that you'd have to make. So it's just a lot more, it becomes a lot more problematic from a logistics perspective. Usually it's not that these individuals are going to cost you too much money. I mean, in our experience, even when you offer part-time individuals entry into the plan, most of them are probably not going to contribute or choose to contribute, in which case they wouldn't cost you too much money either way. And there are also special communications that these individuals have to get regarding some of the employer contributions or the lack thereof, depending on what you decide to do. Now, why would I want to exclude them? Again, there is a cost element, so if they do contribute, and depending on what employer contribution you're making, it may cost you more money to include them. They're also excluded from other benefits, generally speaking, right? Your health and welfare usually doesn't include them, so there might be confusion there. And there are also more complicated vesting rules, as we'll see in a moment, that apply to these individuals. So for vesting, they are required to accrue a year of vesting credit for each year that they work 500 hours. Now, virtually all of our plans require 1,000 hours to accrue a year of vesting credit for any other employee. So the Congress has really complicated this matter by indicating that you have to use 500 hours for this particular group of people. Now, again, luckily the new guidance that came out enables us to exclude years of service prior to 2021. That makes it a little bit simpler because, again, many companies are probably, if they have these individuals, are not tracking hours, and they certainly aren't tracking hours, for years and years and years prior to 2021. So this makes it a lot simpler to compute vesting now that they've limited this somewhat. What happens if somebody becomes eligible under the normal provisions of the plan. See, more complication. They stay on the 500-hour computation requirement, which again, just makes this more complicated. Also, all of my full-time people or people that entered the plan normally and were never an LTPT employee to begin with are given a year of service credit for vesting when they work 1,000 hours, but all of a sudden now I have to calculate 500 hours for everybody else. I mean, there is a fairness aspect to that as well, right? Like if that were to become known by all of the full-time employees, they may not like that idea. So let's see here. So what kind of plan design ideas can we have for LTPTs? You know, if you want to essentially either avoid the rules or maybe simplify your plan, as we mentioned, if your plan does not exclude them by its design currently, you don't have to worry about any of this. So you can always shorten your waiting period from 1 year of service with hours required to something less, you know, 3 months, 6 months, computed on a lapse time basis. Okay. Now again, for lapse time, you just look at the original date of hire and you look at the anniversary date. Let's say it's 3 months. And if they are employed at the 3-month anniversary date, they come into your plan. There's no hours requirement. It doesn't matter if they came and went during that period 10 times. If they're employed on that anniversary date, we have what are called service spanning rules that bring them in, so they wouldn't be excluded. If you have any service-based class exclusions, and we have a lot of plans that have this, right? They exclude part-timers in the document. Remove those, right? They would be highly recommended that you remove those. Again, you only need to change your plan design if these rules apply to you. So if you don't even have any of these folks working for you, you don't have to go change your plan design. But if you do, then we recommend taking that exclusion out and avoid the rules altogether. The bad thing is if I shorten my period, let's say from 1 year to 3 months, I'm generally going to shorten it for everyone, right? That would be the simplest way to do it. Like for everyone, it's 3 months now. And depending on the employer contributions that you're making, especially if they're non-elective or profit sharing, that could add to additional employer contribution cost. So that's something you don't want to just go do without looking at the design of your plan, what kind of contributions you're making, and then coming up with a rational decision on whether it makes sense. All right. The other thing that would be more of a simplification to your plan is if I am going to bring them in and I'm going to, you know, it really doesn't matter if you give them the employer contribution or not. The vesting applies. The new proposed regulations have indicated that you don't even have to give them an employer contribution. But if you change your mind later and you do, anybody that's designated as an LTPT employee is still subject to the 500-hour requirement. So if that's going to be the case and you have these folks in your plan, a simplification would be to just require 500 hours just as your normal vesting schedule for everyone. The bad thing is you are going to accelerate the vesting for quite a few people that might be on the 1,000-hour schedule before you make the amendment. So just some examples, right? If you have a 1 year wait and 1,000 hours in plan, you know, how could you amend this to avoid the rules? Just switch from counting hours to an elapsed time service requirement, right? So again, this requires a plan document amendment. Or you could stay on a year of service requirement and just require fewer hours. You require only 500 hours. That would be acceptable as well. If you have a 60-day requirement that excludes, now I have an excluded class, right? So I'm okay on the elapsed time 60-day requirement, but my plan document is a provision that excludes a service, has a service-based exclusion in it, right? So I could just take that out. That would be the recommended course of action, and then you don't have to comply with the rules anymore. All right. So we got some counting service examples here because it gets a little bit more complicated in how you can count service. So we're gonna go over some of the easiest examples and then look at a little bit more complicated situations. So if you're confident, again, that you meet one of the following, right, and these rules don't apply to you, then you can sort of tune out for the rest of this part of the presentation, okay? But if you've already got a friendly plan design, meaning I've got a shorter than 1 year service wait with an elapsed time method already, right? So I'm not excluding these folks by design. No problem, right? If I don't employ any part-time employees, there are companies that just don't employ them at all. No issue. You know, if you don't have any part-time employees today and you plan to not to hire any or have any in the future, same you know, lack of problem. You can just ignore this. Or if all of your, again, I couldn't imagine trying to determine this for your company, but let's say by chance all of your part-timers work less than 500 hours and always have, right? Good luck determining that over the course of this period. But if you're confident about that, then you don't have to worry about this. All right. Same on the last bullet, if all my part-time employees are part of a permissible excluded class. So in my prior example, I go, you can't have a disguised age or, excuse me, service condition in your plan. But if my field worker group in that prior example has full-time and part-time, you know, it becomes facts and circumstances. So the IRS, if they were looking at this, would go look at your exclusion, and so long as it's just nothing but part-timers, you're probably okay. If you've got a mix of people in there, then that would be okay. If they just happen to be part of a permissible excluded class. So what do I do if I don't feel comfortable, or I feel that I have individuals into my plan that qualify, right? And I don't have a plan design that avoids the rules? You're going to need to run a list of your employees with data hired, job title, and hours. And then you can remove, if you happen to have a permissible class, you know, field workers, hourlies, whatever, that's an exclusion in your document, you would remove that group from that list. And then you go look at the hours that they've worked from 21 to 23. And again, you're looking for 500 and 999 hours in each of those years. All right. So this is the concept we were talking about before, but there are two ways to measure eligibility and service crediting. There's the anniversary date to anniversary date, which is what we've called the elapsed time method, right? And we've got the plan year method, right? So with hours, typically. So most NOVA clients measure eligibility on a plan year basis because it's easier for clients to report the data, right? So the first computation period, we'll look at this again, is required to be the 12-month period. It starts with a data hire. Let me just go to actually, I don't have it on the next slide. It goes from the data hire to the 12-month anniversary date, right, and looks at the hours worked in that first period. And then it switches to the plan year thereafter. But now here's where it gets a little tricky, right? There are special rules that apply, again, when an employee is first hired, your new hires. These special rules apply only to plans that switch to the plan year basis after the first year. But I can tell you the way NOVA drafts their documents, virtually all of ours do this. Okay, it is actually simpler for most plans to switch in this way. All right. So beginning in 2024, you'll need to look at employees hired on or after 2021, right? We're looking at that 3-year period starting with 2021. So the first eligibility computation period is required to start with the data hire and go to the 12-month anniversary date. And then during that period, you look at whatever your hours requirement is. For a year service plan, it's 1,000, right? If you have the hours requirement. The second eligibility computation period starts on the first day of the plan year within the first eligibility period. It'll be easier to look at this visually here in just a moment. So there's an overlap right? So we're going to show this in two ways. This is just written out, right? If I've got somebody with a data hire of 9/1 of 2022, then and we're looking at the January 1st, 2024 entry date, right? The first computation period, again, is required to start on 9/1/2022, and it ends on 8/31/2023. You know, you look at how many hours they work to determine, are they a long-term part-time employee? Let's say they work 600 hours. In the second period, which is going to start in the calendar year, the plan year. Most plans are calendar year, so let's deal with a calendar year plan. It starts 1/1/23 and goes to 12/31. And now you look at that period and see how many hours they work. Let's say 600 again, right? In this example, this individual is going to get 2 years of LTP service, even though they've only been working for 16 months. Sometimes a little easier to look at it in a graphical way. So same example, right? First computation period, data hire to 12-month anniversary date. They work 600 hours here. There's an overlap in a second period that switches. They work 600 hours here. They've got 2 years of service credit, much earlier than you would expect. So for the simple example, if you look at this chart, for any employee hired, they have a hire date prior to January 1st, 2021. And let's assume that this is a calendar year plan that switches to the plan year after the first computation period. Then go ahead and look at just the plan year hours. Why? Because if somebody hired back in 2019 or 18, they've already gone through their first computation period and they have been switched by the terms of your plan document to the plan year. And again, most plans are calendar year. So you're safe looking at calendar year hours for those older hires. All right. So in these examples, and this is a little bit more complicated than the first one because we're showing not only the current requirement, which is what I want you to focus on for 1/1/2024, right? But we're also showing that Congress has shortened the period now to 2 consecutive years of more than 500 hours. But during this period here from 2021 to 2022, 2023, you're looking at those hours thresholds to determine. So row 1, right, this individual is long-term part-time under the rule that we currently have, 3 consecutive years. They're eligible 1/1/2024. All right. Even if their hours drop down later in 2024, they're still eligible because they've already worked the 3 consecutive. All right. So focus on, for now, these 3 years, 21, 22, 23, and look to see if they fall into the hours requirement. On the second row, somebody worked 400 hours in 22. So they're not designated a long-term part-time employee. Same thing for the third row for the 24 entry date. So the third row is an interesting one which brings into play the new shorter hours requirement, right? Now that they had 500 or more in the first 2 years, right? They come in under the new rules in 25. So this is becoming more complicated, but for now, all you need to worry about, because what we want this webinar to get you to do is, if you have, number one, if you have these people in your plan, just understand that you need to offer them your plan 1/1/2024, or your entry date starting in 1/1/24, and typically the first day of the plan year is one of the entry dates. That's what we need you to focus on. You've got to give them enrollment materials here very shortly. So just to recap, see how we're doing on time. All right, good. Again, this is some of what we talked about before. Does my plan already comply? Because if it does, I don't need to worry about any of this. All right. So keep that in mind. Do I have a shorter eligibility waiting period than 1 year with an hours requirement? I mean, if you're not aware of any part-timers being excluded from your plans currently at all, or you don't, right, then you have no issue. If you do, then do you want to deal with these rules, or do you want to amend your plan to otherwise get out of them, right? Which is what we would recommend if you have quite a few of these folks. Again, we need to look at your plan design a little more carefully to see what makes sense, from an employer contribution standpoint primarily. But we would highly recommend that you try to avoid these rules if you can. If you're not amending, then there are some steps you need to take, right? You need to coordinate with your investment provider, which we also call the record keeper, the TPA, which is NOVA, and probably your payroll company to make sure that you're ready to implement this change. And again, the payroll company, if you happen to be, for example, wanting to exclude them from your employer contributions and you're doing a match on a payroll by payroll basis, you're going to have to figure out how to do that within your payroll system. Are they ready to go? Right? That'll probably help you with some of your decision making. There's no amendment required, so at the moment, but we do need to record, anything that's outside of our defaults. Again, our defaults were going to be that NOVA is not going to include these folks in the employer contribution, and and so anything outside of that, you need to tell us. Also, you need to identify who these individuals are fairly quickly or as soon as possible and get them in by the 1/1/2024 entry date. I know it's late, and you're probably wondering, what if I can't get them in by 1/1/24? Try to comply as best you can. You cannot ignore these rules, but there is some administrative leeway in terms of there not being any penalties for a period of time in the first quarter. All right, so if you get them in late, but it's not beyond, let's say, March 31st, and you've done your best to get them enrolled, there should be no penalty. All right. Also, you need to put in processes to look for and enroll long-term part-time employees for any future enrollment dates, right? This is just the first one that's coming up here. If you want to amend your eligibility waiting period to avoid the rules, then you need to consider what kind of budgetary increase in cost that might have on your company, depending on your employer contributions. You'll also, again, most of the other steps are very similar. You need to identify who these individuals are, provide them enrollment materials, and come up with a process for how I'm going to enroll them on an ongoing basis. So we can help, right? I mean, NOVA can help you with this, but we don't normally determine eligibility as part of our service package. So, I mean, we can certainly talk to you about, if you feel that you've got individuals like this in your company, I would encourage you for sure to call us. Let us try to, work through it with you, depending on what you want us to do and how much data we might have to collect. There may be some extra fees involved with that, but I think for the right clients, it'll be very worthwhile to get some assistance, because as you can see, this is rather complicated. If we don't hear from you, we will be preparing a default amendment that indicates that any LTPT employees that are required to come into your plan will not be eligible for the employer contributions. To the extent that you want them to be, again, we've got to document that so that we can draft the amendment to comply with what you're doing in actual practice. We're not going to be amending anybody's eligibility provisions without, or their class exclusions without any permission, so the default will not do any of that. And we won't be changing anything in your vesting schedule other than to add the required schedule for LTP employees, which will only apply if you happen to have any. We can kind of pause here, and we've got some frequently asked questions, but I think at this point we can open up for any questions that have been asked at this point.
Yeah, Steve, this is Craig Hoffman. I've been looking at the questions, so let me jump in and hit a few of them. You can take a look yourself at the question list if you've got time now, but
Okay.
while you were speaking, I was looking. So let me begin with a question that was asked by several folks, and that is it permissible to exclude interns? And the answer is maybe. The reason why I say maybe, it's a question of facts and circumstances. What the proposed regulations clarify very clearly, it is permissible to have a class exclusion, an eligibility condition to get into the plan beyond in addition to completing the service requirement, as long as that eligibility condition is itself not a disguised age or service condition. The proposed regs saying this eligibility condition must not be a proxy for an age and service condition. So that if your interns were only part-time employees, then that, by excluding them by class, the classification of being an intern, it is quite likely, in my opinion, that the IRS would view that as an impermissible proxy for a service condition and could not be used for purposes of long-term part-time employees. Now, somebody else asked, well, we exclude interns, but we have a provision that says if they complete 1,000 hours and get in, and within a year of service, they get into the plan. And that's fine to do with part-time interns because that fail-safe provision brings them back in, but that is only for the normal plan rules. That cannot apply in the case of a long-term part-time employee or an employee who qualifies under the rules we just discussed. So, you know, the type of classification might be people in Omaha are in the plan and people in Des Moines are not. And as long as Omaha has, or Des Moines is made up of a mixture of full-time and part-time employees, that's fine. But that's the key, and nobody can really answer such a question without understanding and examining the underlying facts and circumstances. Another question was, a new plan is established. Can we ignore service prior to the establishment of the new plan for purposes of these rules? And the answer is no and yes. No, you cannot ignore service for eligibility purposes, including eligibility as a long-term part-time employee. But you can exclude service prior to the date of establishment of the plan for vesting purposes, but not for eligibility purposes. We also had a question, well, we have part-time employees, but we also have contractors who get paid with a 1099. Do we have to cover the contractors? And the answer is no. Not only are you not required to, you are prohibited from including an independent contractor in a plan of a sponsoring employer. An independent contractor does not qualify as an employee and therefore is ineligible to participate in a plan sponsored by somebody to whom they render services. It begs a question. There can be some funny business as to whether somebody truly is or is not an independent contractor, but that's for another webinar and another day. The bottom line is if they truly are an independent contractor, they're not an employee and they would not be covered by these plans. We also had a question about how auto enrollment plays into this. And the bottom line is you do not, at least in my opinion, this is my opinion, I haven't put this past the IRS, but in my opinion, auto enrollment is not required for long-term part-time employees unless the plan is subject to the new mandate that the latest law, Secure 2.0, enacted, which beginning in 2025, plans established after December 28th of last year must auto-enroll employees beginning on the first day of the 2025 plan year. So if you establish your plan before December 28th of last year, if you have auto-enrollment, you don't have to apply it to the long term. I wonder if that's more trouble than it's worth, though, in all honesty. If you establish your plan after that date, you will have to auto-enroll people. I guess conceivably you could wait until 2025, whether you have it or not, but one way or another, beginning in 2025, auto-enrollment as mandated by the latest law is equally applicable to long-term part-time employees as anybody else. And one last question about plan amendments. Plan amendments will be required. There is an extended deadline under Secure 2.0, but you have to operationally comply, and we're recommending to people, particularly with some of these plan design changes with some of the record keepers, it's better to do the amendment as soon as you know what you're going to want to do. But clearly an amendment will be needed. It's just a question of the deadline for doing it. I don't know if any other questions came in, Steve. I think that got all that were on there while you were talking.
Yeah. All right. And let me clarify something on what Craig was talking about with an example, right? So the question about I have a new startup plan, for example, that started in 2023. What service do I have to count for the long-term part-time situation, right? We get to exclude service prior to 2021. So I would look at 21. So all service counts, but for LTPT people, it's up to 2021. So you look at 21, 22, and 23. And so the question is, yeah, you do have to look at the service that was worked prior to the establishment of the plan.
Yeah, Steve, thank you for that clarification. You're absolutely on point.
And then the other thing on mandatory enrollment that Craig brought up, we are going to be doing that is another subject all into itself, and we will be doing a separate webinar on all the new mandatory automatic enrollment rules as well. So, you know, if anybody was scratching their head going, what was that all about? It is a whole nother subject unto itself. So I think we have a little bit more time. We can.
Yeah, the general deadline, there are a couple of questions, is the 2025 plan year. But you must maintain operational compliance before then, and you have to maintain records of that so when you do your amendment, it's properly reflected when you do your amendment. So that's why it gets more and more difficult to maintain operational compliance, and some record keepers need the amendment sooner rather than later. Somebody says all our part-timers are 1099. Well, then they're not part-time employees. They're independent contractors working for you, and these rules do not apply. Somebody asked about seasonal employees, or I guess people who are on call. And the bottom line is these rules apply to them, and hours have to be tracked.
Yeah, those are service-based exclusions if they're in your document, you know. So sometimes for certain industries, we see an exclusion for what they call PRN, which I think is code for on-call. But again, to the extent that there are either service-based exclusions or determined to be, right, like all the people in that category are part-time employees, yeah, you need to be considering these rules. I think we have, so Yvette, what, is this a 50-minute or 60-minute? I can't recall here.
50 minutes.
Okay, so we're right about at time. You know, we have some frequently asked questions here. They are going to be available in the slide deck, as well as we have some more summarized attachments that more or less reflect the same information for any of you that have questions. If you feel like you have these types of individuals that qualify under this, for now, the one that really concerns us the most is the 1/1/24 eligibility date, and they have to have that 3-year consecutive. The same person has to have that 3-year consecutive hours window requirement, right? 500 to 999. If you feel like you have those people in your plan, please contact your Nova account manager, or if you're not a Nova client, your provider or TPA that does help you with this, and have a more in-depth conversation.
One last question I forgot to get to. Somebody asked, are Safe Harbor 401k plans covered? And the answer is absolutely yes. There's no exception, but you can exclude the long-term part-time employees from eligibility for contributions, Safe Harbor contributions, if you wish. You will have to include that in your plan document as part of the amendment, and you've got to notify employees appropriately as part of that process.
Right,
All right,
again,
I think we've had as much fun as a couple guys can have, Steve.
great.
Beth, take it away.
Alrighty, perfect. Thank you, guys. Just a few reminders. Like Steve said, if you go to your go-to panel, you'll see a drop down for the handouts, and this is where you will be able to find the copy of today's presentation. If you are not able to see these on your panel, you can email us and we will send you those handouts. For CE credit, be sure to fill out the pop-up survey once this session ends. For any other questions, please be sure to email us webinars@nova401k.com. To view any webinars you may have missed and the recording of this session, you can follow us on our YouTube channel, which is Nova 401k Associates, or visit our website, which is www.nova401k.com/webinars. Thank you so much, Steve and Craig, for your time today, and thanks again to everybody for joining us. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Go on.
Bye.